Thanks for listening. This podcast is a ministry of Mariners Church, and everything we do to serve you, our communities, and our global family happens because of your generosity. Your financial support in the month of June is vital as we close out the final weeks of our ministry year. Everything you give equips us to reach our world with the hope of Jesus and serve those around us in His name. To give now and partner with us, visit marinerschurch.org/give or click the link in the show notes. Thank you for your generosity, and God bless you.
Welcome to the If I Had More Time podcast hosted by Mariners Church. This series invites you into a casual conversation with our senior pastor, Eric Geiger, and our teaching team to hear a few insights and truths they wish they had time to include in the weekend message. We hope you enjoy it. So glad you guys are joining us today for the If I Had More Time podcast. My name is Liz Garcia, and I am here with two amazing team members. I am so excited to be with Van Ibeson, all the way from Mariners Oceanside.
Hello.
We're so glad you're here.
Grateful to be here.
This is your first time on the podcast? No,
Second.
You've been on.
Second.
Yeah. Okay. So this is what his
First
voice
time in this
sounds-
room.
Yeah. New studio. And then we have Steve Bangley.
Great to be here.
Who is our North Irvine lead pastor. And Bang taught at Irvine, and his message, of course, was shared with the beautiful congregation of North Irvine as well. Van taught at Oceanside this weekend. It's a beautiful weekend where all of our congregations got to have a live teacher, which is really special. And so there was a beautiful continuity of what we were teaching this weekend in this passage from Exodus, but also a lot of different takes on it and some different flavors. So I'm really glad that we're going to get to hear from both Van and Steve Bangley today. Would you guys just share with everybody, what was it like preparing for this message? I mean, we are blazing through the book of Exodus in 6 weeks, and you guys just got a really light topic on the plagues. What was it like for you guys in preparing for the message? What was challenging to you? What was exciting to you?
Well, it's a joy going through the scriptures.
That's right.
And it's a familiar story. Maybe you hear it, as a kid and some stories, but then when you really go deep into it, there's so many things that come out of the scriptures that cause you to wonder, but also cause you to be like, why did this happen?
Yeah, right. So you find yourself curious and even investigating a little bit, even as you're preparing.
Absolutely.
These messages.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
I mean, I totally agree. So many people who have gone to church even a couple of times, they're somewhat familiar with the Exodus story. I mean, we have movies crying. I've referenced it in my sermon, Prince of Egypt. And when you see a full-on film, how do you articulate the plagues, which are spectacular, phenomenal, interesting, devastating, all the things? Like, how do you actually articulate that in a compelling way? I found that to be challenging. Mm-hmm. And then we're hitting Passover as well, right? We hit Passover, and it feels like it's one of the plagues, but it just has this different tone. So how do you go from like all these like crazy plagues to let's swing it over to this final one packed with spiritual meaning and significance, and it's all one sermon? That was challenging and fun and exciting.
Right. Well, it's a great message. And I asked Bang and Van both before we got filming today to feel some liberty to even dig into some of these concepts in each of their messages, knowing that not all of you got to hear both of them. So something that was new for me this weekend in this particular message on the plagues was noticing that the plagues that God sent were actually directly linked or countering a counterfeit God or one of those little g gods of that day. I'd love for you guys, as this is a newer concept for some people, myself included, can you unpack that just a little bit?
Yeah, so, in my sermon, I unpacked this idea that really the ancients, they all believed in a divine world. Like this naturalistic, humanistic worldview. It's really recent. It's a modern thing. For the majority of human history, people affirmed divine entities, gods. They created all these sorts of things for life and so forth. And so the question then becomes, in the mind of the ancient Near East individual, who is the God to rule them all? Like, who is right? Who is powerful? And so even military conflict, even nation to nation conflict battles, they weren't seen as just military battles. They were seen as spiritual, whose God is going to win. And so when you see the ancient Near East from that backdrop, I mean, the Exodus account takes a really spiritual meaning of God, the one true God, raising himself up and saying, let me show you who I am. Not in an arrogant, childish, petulant kind of way, but in a truthful, this is who I am. I'm the creator. You know, Alan, I read a book in seminary called Portraits of God by like Alan. I don't even remember his last name. His first name is Alan. Great name.
It's memorable.
But essentially,
I'm sure he's brilliant.
He's brilliant. So brilliant. I can't even remember his last name. But really, the thesis of the book is that, you know, God is holy, meaning he is utterly transcendent, unique, and different. So then, if a holy God is revealing himself to his people and therefore to the world, and there's all these gods that are distinct from him, what is he? You've kind of cornered him. I don't know if that's the right way to put it. You've kind of put him in an interesting place where he's like, I want to reveal myself.
Wow.
I should show myself for who I truly am, so that people are not misled, but see who I am for who I truly am.
Wow.
You know,
That's fascinating because you think about why the plagues, right? Because if you continue reading the Old Testament, there was another Exodus. In fact, it was we were in the book of Daniel, I believe last year or this year, and then we're going to do Nehemiah. There was a people who were not from; they were in Babylon, right? And there wasn't these signs and wonders of their Exodus. It was just God's just stirring the Persian king's heart to let them free. Yeah. And so you have to say, what's the different with this Exodus? Why all the plagues? And to that point, bang, it's God wanting to show himself in a subversive way in light of all the other gods that the Egyptians believed in, to show people. In fact, you read throughout the account, it's to do that, to show the people that he is the God who's faithful, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Boom.
Yeah.
That's good. Van, before we got rolling, you were talking about some of the way that this book was actually constructed or written, how it reflected or mirrored some other parts of Scripture as well.
Yeah. Did some reading. There's a guy by the name of Alan. I don't know his last name. No, it's fascinating when you read some
genius
of the
guy,
commentary.
brilliant scholar. We don't remember his last name.
He's so popular. He doesn't even have a last name. It's just Alan. No. What I read him. There's a lot of consensus amongst Old Testament scholars is that you can see the literary structure even within the plagues, like in plague 1, 4, and I believe 7. It all happened in the morning. It all happened where Moses is asked to confront Pharaoh, and so on and so forth. You're seeing these things that take place. You're seeing a pattern taking place, the hardening, the ongoing hardening, the relenting a little bit of Pharaoh, but then not relenting ultimately. So there's just really a pattern that's taking place. And again, Hebrew writers, they don't waste words. There's deep significance in that. And again, it's one, to showcase God's power over these little g gods.
Wow. Brilliant. The authors of these books.
I mean, I think of one significant one. I didn't know in studying. We know that the oppression of the Israelites, one, Pharaoh, he saw the Israelites as a threat. So what does he do? He instructs the genocide of the firstborn sons into the Nile River. What's the first plague? It's the river of the Nile it was blood. Why? It's almost this poetic justice God, the God who says, hey, the Pharaoh before you, I know what he did. It's kind of like the sequel, I know what you did last summer.
But then the last one is the firstborn.
Yeah.
So he kind of brings it all together.
Yeah, there's a pattern there. There's intention in the writings,
Yeah, it's incredible.
It is a little, speaking of the fear of the Lord, it is a little frightening. I mean, in terms of his creation account, the creation account in Genesis 1, brilliant, tactful, creative. And then you come over to judgment and it's like, it is just as creative and brilliant. So, you talk about the fear of the Lord, the holiness of God, all the things, it's right there.
Yeah. So as we're talking about these little g gods, I think about our people and I'm asking, I have a question about that time and I have a question about today. I'll let you guys decide which one we want to hit first. My question for the context of this passage is about these little g gods. Did they really have power? Our God is powerful. We know that. What kind of power did he allow those little g gods to have? And then my other question is for our friends today, which are, what does that look like today? Like, what are our little g gods right now? Do we have little g gods today? So you guys can pick which one you want to go first.
Well, as a expert on sorcery, I'll have Bango answer the first one. I'll do the second. No.
Beautiful. Well, I will go with the first one. It's you have to slice, I think, that concept in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, does a statue have power? No. Does some concept of an imaginary character have power? No. But once you start giving allegiance to an idea, once you start giving affection and devotion to any created object, is there power? Absolutely. And then underneath that, we know that we live in a supernatural world. We know that God is the king of the world, and yet presently, 1 Corinthians, Satan is the god over this age. And so is there the presence of darkness? Absolutely. I mean, we going back to the sermon, in Exodus, in the account, we find, this is so fascinating, the magicians in Pharaoh's courts are able to actually mirror and mimic the first two plagues. That's kind of terrifying. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think this was some show at some Vegas magic show, right? I mean, where's that power coming from? It came from a satanic opposing power. Now, they were limited. So do gods have power in and of themselves? No, because we know that Ra, the sun god, doesn't exist. We know that Happy, the god of the Nile, doesn't really exist. But are there demonic opposing forces that can deceive 100%? And deceive in the mind and the heart and the emotions? Yes. And that's kind of sobering for us, I think.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think to the latter question, where do we see that today?
Yeah.
Where do we see it? I think the confrontation of Moses and Pharaoh to let my people go, the response of Pharaoh was, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him?"
I
think
referenced the same passage in my sermon.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very fascinating, and it's one of the things that we say about this series, and we say this a lot about all the scripture, is that it's not just their story, the people of Israel, but it's our story as well. And I think that question that Pharaoh asked is really what our culture and even ourselves ask ourselves as well. Like, should I obey God? Like maybe in my mind, I love the idea and the concept of God, but what would my heart say? What would my affections and desires say?
That's good.
Yeah.
Is he the one that I should obey, that I should make him, like, we love the idea, we say Jesus is Lord and Savior. We love the idea that Jesus is our Savior, but sometimes our actions betray us that we don't actually look at him as Lord over my life. And I think that was Pharaoh's question.
Yeah, and I just think about, and just to be vulnerable on the podcast, Alan, no, I'm gonna drop the author, but I think like control, for example.
Yeah.
I love control.
Yeah.
And there have been times in my life where it has absolutely been a stronghold in my life. Now there's no God of control. Well, maybe there's a bunch of apps that help me to control my life better.
Right.
And maybe those are little G gods or statues, right? But I just think it is so easy for us to look back and be like, those primitive people with their fun little drawings of these gods, telling stories that become oral tradition. And yet here we are thousands of years later, and we might call them different names.
Yeah.
But I wrestle, I struggle, I feel the pull of temptation. I feel like I'm in the battle,
Yeah.
you know,
right.
and I
Yeah.
feel like it's my story.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, it might have been Tim Keller who said this, but he says, whenever we look to a created thing to provide for us what only the Creator can provide, we have bought into a little G God.
That's the
a little
test.
idol.
Yeah.
And he also said, like, to who or what do you look to and say, tell me who I am?
Wow.
And I think for us, it's not the cartoon characters or the little G gods, it's significance, to my worth.
Yeah.
And so that can manifest in so many different ways.
Yeah. You guys are reminding me right now of I spent some time when I was in college. I spent a summer in South Asia with a campus crusade.
Cool.
A lot of people know about Cru. And one of the things that we did one day was we went and visited a Hindu temple. And there's just tons that I could say about the experience overall, but on this topic, I had one of the most significant experiences, I think, of my walk with Jesus that shaped me so much. I saw a woman who she could not pay her way into this temple. So like problem number one, right? Could not pay her way into the temple. So she was just outside, and God just kind of captivated me with her. I was watching her as she leaned up against the wall of the temple on the outside, desperately praying. And it was this particular God, it was a tree that she was praying to. And I remember I walked out of there just like, I was like, that's so dumb. Like I remember thinking so small of those people because they were all worshiping these statues and a tree, and they were bringing their baked goods or their flour. And I thought, how primitive, like how, like I was looking down on them really. And it was probably the next day. I can't remember my leader. I was sharing this experience with my leader, and the look he kind of gave me was like, uh-oh, there's something there for me to investigate. And I remember I took it before God, and just so clearly he was telling me, your little g gods are just as hopeless as that tree. Your God of control, your God of your image, success, all those things, they're just as hopeless. They are going to bring you just as much satisfaction as that woman who was praying to that tree.
I'm thinking about a conversation I had with a pastor and who was ministering overseas, and they said that when they visit the United States, they often they're like, oh, we know exactly what your gods are, because our homes are oriented around our gods. And when we come to your homes in the United States, it's oriented around the TV screen.
Wow.
It's oriented around X, Y, and Z. And so it was funny to see those who from the global world come and go, oh, we know exactly what your gods are. Like you don't call them gods, but we see them just as clearly as you see our gods clearly.
Wow.
Right?
Yeah.
And so
super helpful.
we're in it.
Yeah. I was just kind of about to go there. It's like, so what signals should we look out for in our lives when we have made a god out of something? What comes up for you? What reveals that to us?
Well, Tim Keller says two things. He says it's fear. So what do you fear losing? What do you fear most? You can typically find something, an idol orbiting around there. And then he says, what do you long for? What do you dream about when you're not distracted by your phones, when you're alone in your thoughts? Where does your mind go to? And whatever that thing that you are longing for, that you see yourself doing or achieving, perhaps, he didn't say that those are the idols. He just says those are, idols clearly going to orbit around there. So it could be like things like, in both directions for my wife and I, I long for my kids to walk faithfully in the Lord, to be successful in life. I know that if I'm not careful, that can become an idol. Even the good things of the Lord, the blessings of the Lord can become an idol.
I almost feel like most idols are good things elevated and blown up.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right? It's not often like this terrible, awful thing.
Yeah.
Most idols are really, they're gifts from the Lord that we turn into a God.
Yeah.
Right. And so I loved your definition. For me, I'm not going to quote Tim. You have all of his quotes memorized, man. Come on, Van. You're embarrassing me on this podcast. No, for me personally, I just know when there isn't a lot of gratitude, there's like almost this entitled spirit. I just know something's going on here. Like I'm not leaning on my creator as, my God, my true God. And I know the other one is my prayer life is often a wonderful indicator. Like when my prayer life, when there is a dependence, when I'm asking him for support, when I'm turning to him, when I'm delighting in him, I just know, hey, I think my heart is tracking.
Yeah.
But when that starts to shrivel up a little bit, I know something's off. So those are some signs for me.
Yeah.
Super helpful. Really, really practical. Well, I have one more question about the text that I think is a really common question. What about that phrase about Pharaoh's heart being hardened? What do we make of that, and what do we make of God in light of that text?
So Tim Keller, no, I'm kidding. It's an amazing text. And on the one hand, I don't want to make it overly simplistic.
Sure.
And yet, the God who invites us to childlike faith, we don't have to overcomplicate it either. When we think about, so we're going to get to the human freedom piece in a moment. But when we talk about God's judgment, one of the things I think that's easy to ignore is one of the scariest forms of his judgment is when he gives us over to our desires. Yeah. That's Romans 1, is when God says, that's what you really want? You want independence from me? I will give that to you. You want to pursue that road of destruction? I'm trying to love you away from that. But if that's what you ultimately want and you want to keep resisting me, I will give you over to your desires. So one, this hardening of heart is God giving Pharaoh what he truly, truly wants. So it is a form of judgment. Now, I think the question is God hardening his heart, or is Pharaoh hardening his own heart? Which is it? In other words, is God sovereign, or does Pharaoh have freedom? And I think the answer is yes. Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, I mean, how many times in the text, I think it's Pharaoh hardens his heart 3 times.
Yeah.
It's mentioned, and then God hardens his heart 6 times.
And it's important to note that at the beginning, we were reading that Pharaoh hardened his heart.
That's correct.
It was really later on where God says, I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. In other words, pretty much that, to say, hey, this is the direction in which he is going. I'm going to allow it to happen. Wow. The hardening of heart. Because we think of like the active wrath of God, like the plagues. The passive wrath of God is just as scary, if not scarier. Wow. Where, according to Romans 1, he gives them over to their desires. Like no intervention, no protection. God just says, if this is what you want, go at it. Wow. No.
It's sobering. It's saddening. And I think for our listeners, if anyone is listening and if you've ever had this thought, but I just want to live however I want my entire life, and at the very last second, I'll hurry up and give my life over to Jesus. And he can do that. He can absolutely do that without a doubt. But where Pharaoh is a cautionary tale for us is actually our hearts.
Yeah. If
we drive our hearts to a certain direction, God may be a willing participant in what we truly want.
Yeah.
And so, I'm thinking about Hebrews. If you hear my voice today, don't harden your heart. Don't be a stiff-necked people. So when we hear the call of grace, I think there's wisdom in responding.
Yeah, I thought about the Pharisees in the New Testament when I'm reading this, because even people say, I'll believe in God when I see a miracle, when I see a sign. What other sign for the Egyptians, if not plagues? If gnats and frogs and hail, and yet Pharaoh's heart was still hardened.
That's right.
Because it's not, we say I just need the proof. It's the hardening of our hearts. I mean, you think about the Pharisees, and Jesus healed people with leprosy, a very physical disease, and yet they still did not believe. And so, sometimes we can fool ourselves in thinking, if I just had that, if I saw a sign in the sky, more locusts, whatever. But no, it's the condition of our hearts.
So true.
It actually hardened.
Yeah.
Like in other words, if we ask God for a sign, that could be what hardens our hearts.
Yeah.
Because it exposes and reveals what's already inside.
Yeah.
In other words, we don't want God. So if we truly don't want God and we see a miracle, we will find a way to use that to harden our own hearts.
Yeah, if you think about it, there were some Egyptians who found shelter in these plagues in Israel homes, and then even some Egyptians who, we know this from the text, they actually went to the Exodus with the Israelites. So the same source, the sun, can melt and also harden clay. Wow. For Pharaoh, his condition, his posture was a hardened clay, and for some of these Egyptians who saw this and saw the true Yahweh, despite their other small gods, their hearts were melted. So it's really not the source, it's really the condition of their hearts.
And for anyone listening who's wondering, but what about human freedom? What about God's sovereignty? They're both in there. The invitation is, there's a mystery. Like we're invited, they both are present, they both exist. Charles Spurgeon has this great quote where he says, I don't need to explain it because you don't need friends to friends don't reconcile. And so divine sovereignty, human responsibility, they're friends. We don't need to reconcile them. They fit together mysteriously. God is not going to be, at the end of the age, going to be like, hey, Pharaoh, I just want to apologize. I'm so sorry for hardening your heart. No, Pharaoh will be responsible.
Yeah.
At the same time, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. So we see both at play.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think of like even in the New Testament, sometimes Jesus will talk about, the power structures. And so sometimes he's talking about Rome and he's also talking about the Rome at large. And I think the same is true with Pharaoh. There is a literal Pharaoh, historical Pharaoh, but there's also a lot of pharaohs in a bigger scale. And I think when we look at, the book of Exodus as it relates to our story as well, we look at our own lives. Do we have a little bit of pharaohs in our lives? Do we have a little bit of idols lurking in our hearts as well?
Yeah. That's great. It's super helpful, you guys. I'm really grateful for how you took, truthfully, it's a daunting text. It's one of the goriest scenes that we have,
crazy.
That we study. So thank you guys so much for how you faithfully taught the text truthfully and helped make it really practical for us. I'm really, really grateful. I'd love for you guys each just to close with, if everybody could take away one thing, what do we learn about God? Like, I know that you preached a whole 32-minute message on it.
That's even harder.
So, right, exactly. So if you could just, in one succinct phrase, couple phrases, I'll allow it, what do you hope people take away about God from this passage?
Yeah, the title of the message is Plagues and Passover. And I think the story continues and unfolds ultimately to the last plague. And it's just a beautiful foreshadowing. Like we cannot miss reading this text without foreshadowing a greater Exodus, a greater Passover, a greater sacrifice. And so we're actually going to partake of communion as we teach this live in our spaces, and that's what we get to orient our hearts to, a greater sacrifice.
Wow.
I think the takeaway for me would be, he is much more gracious than you could ever imagine. Wow. Because I think what the text and the stories, the thread that it's pulling on is, in truth, if we take the whole of Scripture, put them in a blender, the reality is the plagues should actually fall upon all of humanity. Because we've all sinned. We've all gone astray. But the fact that God introduces to the whole people of Israel this concept of sacrifice, it's a foreshadow of the coming of Jesus and the Passover lamb. It's amazing that he weaves into history. He embeds into the very fabric of his people. I am a God who provides a sacrifice. And so I think just for the listener, if you're driving or if you're on a treadmill or you're on a walk, his grace is so much bigger than you could imagine. That whatever you're regretting, whatever sin you think you can never forgive yourself of, he is infinitely more gracious than you know. And that's your God.
Well said.
So beautiful. Thank you both so much. Thank you for being with us today on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And I know all of our church, man, I'm certain we're loving walking through the book of Exodus already, and it's only week 2. So I'm really excited for weeks to come as well. Thank you guys so much for joining us on the If I Had More Time podcast. Thanks for listening to the If I Had More Time podcast hosted by Mariners Church. We hope to see you next weekend at any of our congregations throughout Southern California or online. To view our locations and service times, be sure to check out our website at marinerschurch.org.